Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, those that are joining us from different parts of the world. This is the final webinar in the series that WCL organized in celebration for the first time of Environment Week. 5 major events, and we end today with a sort of grand finale talking about biodiversity and, of course, making the connection between science, policy, and law. I am privileged to have this panel of outstanding experts chaired by my dear colleague, Professor Christina Voigt from the University of Oslo, who herself is an expert on the subject from an international law perspective, but also from a national and comparative perspective, as well as she has been a member of the negotiating team for Norway for many, many years and advising her government on those important issues. I don't need to say how relevant biodiversity is for environmental law, although the term itself is a new comer to the environmental law vocabulary, but it is now pervasive in the legal literature and also in the jurisprudence. Not so much as we would like to see, because especially judges still focus more on the elements of biodiversity, fauna, flora, etc., than on the holistic concept, which indeed pose theoretical and practical difficulties for those that apply the legal system in place. The idea in this panel is to discuss the topic, as I said, from a scientific perspective, moving into policy and then law, and combining the international and national components as much as possible. I will ask my dear colleague, Professor Christina Voigt, to take the lead and introduce the fantastic panel that we have today. We are so privileged we have today with us. Professor Christina Voigt.
Thank you very much, Justice Antonio Benjamin. Thank you for your kind words of introduction and also for spearheading this initiative of an environmental week to celebrate the World Environment Day. And we've had 4 webinars this week already. This, as Antonio said, is the last one in the series. And if the audience, if you missed some of the other webinars, they are all recorded and will be made available online on our website of the Iucn World Commission on Environmental Law. Now, before I introduce our expert panel, let me also add some words about today's topics, just to second Justice Benjamin's thoughts. Biodiversity is life. Biodiversity is the book of life. Biodiversity is defined as the variability of life forms, and it's comprising of ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. But biodiversity is under daily threat. The 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBS, showed very clearly that nature and its vital contributions to people are deteriorating worldwide. The report stated the biosphere, upon which humanity as a whole depends, is being altered to an unparalleled degree across all spatial scales. Biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. Direct drivers for this decline are human activities. land and sea use change, direct exploitation, that's harvesting and hunting, climate change, pollution, and the introduction of invasive species. Now, the report also states, and that should give us some hope for optimism, the report states that nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably, while at the same time meeting other global societal goals through urgent and concerted efforts fostering transformative change. The World Environment Day tomorrow, with Pakistan as its host, will see the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I think we saw the launch already today, the Ecosystem Decade, the Decade on Ecosystems Restoration from 2021 to 2030. And Pakistan's 10 billion tree tsunami project is one of many important examples of reversing and restoring nature. Now, the report also identified 5 critical levers to enable transformative change, and I hope we will be able to discuss all 5 of them today. But among them, the report identified environmental law and governance and their implementation as one of the crucial levers to enable transformative change. So environmental law and governance is crucial to turn the tide. It's crucial to change behavior and values. Both on the international and the national level, we see the vast development of environmental law. On the international level, this year holds an important expectation, and that is the adoption of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity, a framework that hopefully consists of targets, goals, missions, and all to support the vision for 2050 of living in harmony with nature. The negotiations under the subsidiary bodies of the convention are ongoing as we speak for 2 weeks already and another week to come. And I'm sure Elizabeth and Jane were going to tell us more about where we are. The virtual format adopted to adjust to the constraints of the current pandemic is not an easy one, as we all know by now, but parties and stakeholders appear to be committed to making progress despite the constraints, or even perhaps because of the constraints, because the linkages between the pandemic, which was caused by zoonotic disease, and the deterioration of wild places has made clear the close connection between nature conservation, human health, and the environment. We all hope to see a strong and robust framework emerging and to be adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties under the Convention on Biological Diversity in October in Kunming in China this year. However, the global framework can only be as strong as the sum of its parts. And these parts are, amongst other things, national laws and regulations adopted by states when implementing those new global goals and targets. And the message that framework carries to all of society, to corporate actors, to private citizens, to indigenous peoples and local communities, to women and children, the next generation, who will be starkly impacted if nature is not conserved and sustainably used, and the decline reversed. National environmental laws and the environmental rule of law, and by the way, we just finished the 5th meeting of the Montevideo program in Nairobi, which was going on for the last 3 days. The environmental rule of law will be decisive to reach this objective. And so will be the effective implementation, compliance, and enforcement of environmental laws. WCL, through its 2016 global IUCN World Declaration on the Environmental Rule of Law, outlined 13 principles for developing and implementing solutions for ecologically sustainable development. And we hope that they will inform decision makers and implementers alike worldwide. They will certainly be also of use to judges and who will already face with many biodiversity-related cases. Perhaps it is just a matter of time until the wave of litigation, which we currently see with respect to climate change, also sweeps over to biodiversity loss. The human rights impacts of such loss have already been clearly laid out by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights for the Environment. With this as our background canvas, it is with my greatest pleasure to introduce our expert panel today. We have Mrs. Elizabeth Raymer with us. Elizabeth is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Welcome, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a Tanzanian biodiversity leader and lawyer, and she was appointed as the Executive Secretary last year in 2020, and she is the first African woman to hold this role. She previously held numerous leadership roles and positions, among them, for example, the director of the Environmental Law Division at the United Nations Environment Program. We also have with us Miss Angela Andrade. Hello, Angela. Angela is the Director of Environmental Policy of Conservation International Colombia. She is the chair of the Iucn Commission on Ecosystem Management, and she was centrally involved in the Iucn Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. We also have with us Dr. Jane Smart. Hello, Jane. Jane is the Global Director of the Iucn Biodiversity Conservation Group and its director, the director of the Iucn Global Species Program. Further, we have with us today Professor Thomas Lovejoy. Hello, Thomas. Thomas is the godfather of biodiversity. I found somewhere referred to you. He is the president of the Amazon Biodiversity Center and a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation and university professor in the Environmental Science and Policy Department at the George Mason University. And we have with us Dr. David Boyd. Hello, David. David Boyd is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and he is a professor as well of law at the University of British Columbia. And with this fantastic panel, I would like to start our discussion today with Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you are in the midst of it all. You are as the director, the executive director of the Convention on Biological Diversity. You see it all developing as we speak. Elizabeth, may I ask you, what is your view on what role does an international legal framework play in the context of conserving biological diversity? Where are we in international law, and which developments can we expect in the nearer future?
Thank you very much, Christine, and greetings to all my dear panelists, as well as the participants in different probably time zones. Very good question you have asked, and you have indicated at the beginning how important environmental rule of law is concerned. You have also mentioned, and as we speak now, we have our two subsidiary bodies currently meeting, discussing, among other things, contributing elements to the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework to be adopted later this year. This framework will replace the current strategic plan, which ended actually last year in December, and also replace the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. Unfortunately, we have failed as a global community to fully meet any of them although progress has been made in about 6 of them. And that, in short, is basically the development of how we have fared in the last decade or 10 years. Christina, you have indicated the IPBES report, how dear statistics it has given us in terms of loss of biodiversity, unprecedented in the human history, with over 1 million species going to extinction, and even statistics equally from other reports thereafter still are not giving us a good picture. Scientists are telling us this is the last chance we have. We either make it or perish with the planet. So if it's the last decade, indeed, what needs to be done to make that difference and enable this global community to continue to survive beyond this decade, and to also have a planet, a sustainable planet to leave behind to our children and grandchildren. So clearly, it is the understanding also of the global community that the new framework being negotiated will be transformative and innovative. 2, that the new framework will be universally implemented. And that is one of the major lessons we have learned from among the failures of the Aichi target, namely that it was anticipated or expected that only governments were responsible for its implementation, forgetting, as you have said, that biodiversity is life. And if it is life, it means each and every one of us is responsible for its implementation. So be it the youth, be it the indigenous peoples, local community, be it the industry, be it the finance, the banks, the NGOs, everybody has a role to play. So learning from that, we hope that the new framework will really embrace this stakeholder ownership moving forward for its implementation. So where does the law come in? Any document adopted, it is as good as it is unless it moves from being a paper to on-the-ground implementation, on-the-ground enforcement. And this is where environmental rule of law comes in, to really set that enabling environment for the implementation of this framework, for instance, enabling environment in terms of policies, strategies, relevant laws, regulations, and then effective implementation and enforcement of all those structures. And once we have the relevant laws, particularly at national level for its implementation, this is where then the role of other different stakeholders come in. Is it the judges who will be deciding different cases on related to implementation of the framework, or the related to biodiversity, and looking at really those sanctions which bring nature back to place, as opposed to those sanctions of taking people to prison while the nature continue to be polluted and depleted. So I look at law as an instrument of implementation and enforcement to help us with that effective implementation, to help us also to show nature is no longer free for all to pollute, but nature need also to be costed in the day-to-day operations of the different stakeholders benefiting from nature. So maybe I stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you for pointing out the important role of the rule of law in this context. It's a wonderful way to start off our discussion. If I can just ask one more question, you pointed out to all of society, all the different sectors that play in the challenge that we're seeing them, which means also that in addressing that challenge and providing a solution, we have to adopt cross-cutting, intersectoral measures? How can you see the law is developing in this regard? How does the law has to be defined, or maybe what innovative approaches do we have to see to really address all these different drivers and causes of biodiversity decline?
Thank you again. I think law now needs to move away from silo, sectorial laws on specific themes. Clearly, and probably Christina, you know better than myself, today we cannot deal with climate change in isolation to biodiversity loss, in isolation to land degradation, for instance. Likewise, in isolation to water issues. So this is where now we need to see a new movement of law, environmental law, in terms of looking at issues in an integrated fashion. Otherwise, then, if we continue with the old thinking, old mechanism of law, this is biodiversity law, this is climate change law, one, there will be a lot of conflict and overlap, but two, then while the world is moving into a whole of society, whole of government, one integrated approach, then law will be moving in the different direction. So actually we need law also to join this momentum in terms of bringing the pieces together into an integrated fashion. And especially when we all know that environment has no boundaries. And if it has no borders, how do we distinguish one branch of law against the other one?
Exactly. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And we'll come back to the issue of integration and cross-cutting in integral approaches. Before we delve deeper into questions of law and governance, I would like to point a question to Thomas, the godfather of biodiversity. Thomas, we've mentioned already a little bit the status quo of biodiversity and the driver of biodiversity decline, but how are we doing in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use? Where are we, and what needs to be done, and how fast?
So the short answer to that is we need to do a lot and do it very quickly. The biodiversity of the planet, as we've already heard, is in a precarious state. Brazil just had the worst deforestation this past May in ever its history. Half of it was illegal. So that immediately ties it to law. But I've been thinking a lot about the trends in the last year or two, so clearly laid out in the IPBES report. I think basically the global economic model, by and large, ignores the essential role of biodiversity in our daily lives, and that it in fact nourished the rise of human civilization. And to give you a sense of scale of loss, just one statistic. There is so much CO2 in the atmosphere from destroyed terrestrial nature that it's actually equal to what remains in existing nature. So the human model of occupation of the landscape is clearly not perfectly designed or well designed, leaving aside the implementation issues. So I think it is time to introduce a new element, which of course will provide important opportunities for the law in implementation, namely by putting the economics of ecosystems squarely on the table with everything else. Just a few months ago, the UK Treasury received a report that it initiated from Professor Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge. And it made a very clear point, as I'm sure Elizabeth is already aware, and probably everybody in this session on the screen anyway is aware, that the value of ecosystem services has to be included in the way national governments make their decisions. And basically that means every country has to do what only a small number have done so far, which is to create their own national accounting of their biological resources, essentially national natural capital accounts, and then build a framework of law around that, which encourages human behavior that builds up those accounts rather than tears them down. And lastly, every living thing, plant, animal, microbe, every one of us on this panel are part of evolutionary lines that are about 3.7 billion years old. And I believe it is actually wrong to terminate one of those lines of evolution. And another way to look at it is each one of those lines of evolution, whether it be a plant or an animal or whatever it may be, actually represents a series of solutions tested over evolutionary time to biological opportunities and challenges. In fact, every day, every species is inventing new ones. And any one of those inventions has the capacity to revolutionize the life sciences, which only makes the point that our natural resources represented by all that biological diversity are the most important resources in support of human society. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, both for pointing out where we are and also pointing to maybe the main underlying problem. I do have a question on that, but before we go there, I just wanted to pick up on the very first thing you said. You said we have to do a lot and we have to move or to do it very quickly. Do you have any indications of what that time limit is? How much has to be done when in order to avert the most severe consequences?
Well, I think everybody on this panel has a sense of that, and Elizabeth probably first and foremost. At the CBD COP, there are a bunch of potential targets that will be discussed, and hopefully they will be ambitious and committed to and then fulfilled. Will they get us where we need to be in the end? No, but they are an important step, a hugely important step in the right direction, which we can work on while we're trying to refine this larger biodiversity economic picture.
Thank you, Tom. And one question to the economic, and then as a follow-up, the legal framework that you pointed to. You suggested, or you pointed to the need of national accounting system for biological resources. And by stating that there's a need for national accounting system, do you actually say, or are you saying that we basically don't know what we have while biodiversity is disappearing? There's a certain level of ignorance attached to it, because what we have, the entire extent of biodiversity, is not well known, and therefore both the economic and then, as a follow-up, the legal system are inadequate to protect it and restore it.
So I would say, you know, the science gives us a succession of approximations of how much is endangered and how much has been fairly carefully conserved and protected. But it doesn't give us a way to make biodiversity positive decisions when we are talking in the economic realm. There's a small number of countries that have already done this, and so they should be applauded. And the United Nations has actually done considerable work over decades of how you might do this. But I think the Dasgupta report on the economics of biodiversity shines a spotlight on it as a critical way forward.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Let me move on to Angela. Angela, you have worked for a long time on conservation issues, biodiversity conservation, and you have published quite significantly in this field. Angela, what is your take? Which measures are needed to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity? Can you mention a few, and can you mention perhaps also what is your take on what role does law play in the toolbox of measures that you could suggest?
Bueno, muchas gracias, Cristina, y es un gusto saludarlos desde Colombia. Sin duda, y ya se mencionó anteriormente, las crisis que vivimos hoy en día están todas conectadas e interdependientes. Y hemos desarrollado muchos mecanismos de gestión fragmentados y por lo tanto hemos visto que se han venido generando externalidades e impactos en el largo plazo y también a nivel social que no han sido abordados. Y de hecho, vemos la urgencia de empezar a cambiar un poco el paradigma, a cambiar la forma de abordar los problemas. Y para esto debemos empezar a promover las soluciones más de tipo sistémico, pero ante todo partiendo del hecho de que la economía global debe basarse en la salud de los ecosistemas y la naturaleza. Y eso hasta ahora siempre ha estado alejado, siempre hemos visto que la naturaleza es infinita y que es una externalidad. El gran reto es cómo hacerlo en la práctica. Entonces, pues sin duda tenemos que trabajar mucho en la remoción de subsidios perversos. En muchos casos esto se está impulsando, la deforestación, por ejemplo, en la Amazonía, la urgencia de trabajar en múltiples escalas, de involucrar las comunidades locales y los pueblos indígenas, de ver la articulación que hay entre las áreas urbanas y su entorno rural. Mientras esto no lo logramos, pues no lo logremos, estaremos realmente generando externalidades adicionales. Entonces, poco a poco el discurso creo que tiene que ir más hacia la búsqueda de instrumentos como pueden ser las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, como es fortalecer los principios de prevención, de precaución, que reconozcan el valor de la naturaleza y que lo pongan en el centro. Yo diría pues que como unas acciones prácticas, porque realmente nosotros hemos evitado, o tal vez por nuestra forma de ver la gestión ambiental, la hemos concentrado en ciertas áreas, pero nos hemos olvidado de la urgencia realmente de abordar estas causas subyacentes de pérdida de la biodiversidad. Entonces, cuando miremos el tema de la conservación, Sin duda, pues hoy en día y con urgencia, como lo menciona Thomas en su presentación, tenemos que desarrollar acciones que nos permitan de una manera urgente retener estos ecosistemas intactos o mínimamente transformados, y reconocer que muchos de estos territorios pertenecen a comunidades indígenas o a comunidades locales cuyos derechos deben ser reconocidos. También debemos evitar la profundización o la creación de conflictos sobre tenencia de la tierra, que eso es un factor subyacente en muchos casos. En la Amazonía, en el caso colombiano, es evidente. Debemos también extender con urgencia estas labores de conservación a las tierras laborables y a los ecosistemas urbanos, que siempre los hemos visto aparte, y la conservación muchas veces se ha centrado en las áreas protegidas, que sin duda han cumplido un rol fundamental, y de no ser por eso estaríamos en una situación supremamente grave. Pero hoy en día, por los efectos del cambio climático, por los mismos impactos que tenemos, nosotros tenemos que ver la urgencia de involucrar estos criterios en otro tipo de ecosistemas y en otro tipo de territorios. Entonces, esto nos lleva realmente a la urgencia de ver de una forma integral la gestión urbana, la gestión del ordenamiento territorial, de buscar incentivos que nos permitan fortalecer, por ejemplo, la función ecológica de la propiedad, la promoción de sistemas de producción y consumo sostenibles. Esto, y obviamente asegurar que nuestras áreas protegidas puedan realmente ser efectivas y que no sean un centro de amenaza, como hoy en día también lo estamos viendo en muchos de nuestros territorios. Acompañada de esta visión de la conservación integral, digamos holística, también pues hoy en día y hoy en la mañana Elizabeth anunció el inicio oficial de la década de restauración, algo que estábamos esperando con mucha expectativa, porque muchas veces nos preguntamos qué pasó, si estamos restaurando desde hace 10 años, está en el discurso. No lo hemos logrado porque realmente creo que le falta el apoyo político, pero también no hemos visto el sentido de lo que es mantener la integridad ecológica y la función que esto cumple de una manera efectiva para suministrar el bienestar humano. Y recientemente pues también hemos visto la urgencia de combinar estas acciones de restauración con otro tipo de elementos que muchas veces están solamente mirando el componente de la vegetación. Entonces se habla de restauración y en muchos casos vemos que nos están sembrando plantas exóticas en un territorio natural. Entonces, esas son cosas que nosotros tenemos que corregir con urgencia. Adicionalmente, tenemos que mirar el componente de lo que hoy en día, pues, que llamamos rewilding, que eso viene desde hace unos años, que es volver a la naturaleza silvestre, pero realmente buscar la reconstrucción de todas las cadenas tróficas y de los procesos y funciones ecológicas, reconociendo el valor intrínseco de especies y ecosistemas. Y sobre el tema de uso sostenible, pues para no extenderme mucho, pues pienso que es fundamental que estas prácticas de uso sostenible se sustenten en los principios del enfoque ecosistémico. El enfoque ecosistémico es la base de las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, es la base científica que nos da los elementos de integración de aspectos socioecológicos, culturales, y hemos visto que en muchos de estos temas, por ejemplo, el caso de las pesquerías, es urgente empezar a revisar y a entender estos vínculos entre los ecosistemas y el hábitat de especies, porque muchas de las soluciones que hemos dado y de la legislación que hoy en día tenemos mira solamente a especies y establecemos vedas de pesca o establecemos vedas para la extracción selectiva de especies, pero realmente este tipo de acciones hoy en día requieren ver la integralidad de la naturaleza, porque y en muchos casos se están tomando, por ejemplo, soluciones como más que imponer vedas, dejar descansar un territorio, dejar descansar un río durante un periodo de tiempo, porque todas las especies con su diferente rol que cumplen, su edad, no es solamente el tema de solo extraer especies de cierto tamaño, sino todas cumplen una función ecológica. Entonces, de pronto estamos alterando y estamos afectando esa cadena de la vida de la que estábamos hablando. Entonces, es un llamado realmente, es un reto, creo. Así como para la ciencia ha sido un reto entender la complejidad sobre la que estamos trabajando. Imagino que también para los encargados de promover y desarrollar la legislación es un gran reto poder abordar la integralidad. Y si no lo hacemos, pues vamos a seguir generando externalidades en el tiempo y en el espacio, perjudicando comunidades, pero ante todo poniendo en peligro la vida, que es realmente el eje que tiene que guiar nuestras acciones.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you in Spanish, but I was instructed not to switch languages. So thank you so much, Angela, for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking observations. Thank you so much for that. I also wanted to mention that you are the co-author of a new article that is about to be published, or has already been published, titled Guiding Principles for Rewilding, and it's coming out in Conservation Biology. I think some of the principles you mentioned are probably these guiding principles in your article. If you want to fill in with some more, I'll give you the chance in a second. But you also mentioned climate change, Angela, and it's very interesting because we had 5 webinars on very different topics, but in each one of them, climate change really popped up as a very central topic. But Angela, you mentioned climate change, and we all know that nature-based solutions based on an ecosystem approach, as you put it, are very important elements also to address climate change in terms of climate mitigation measures. However, we do know that these measures are not always well aligned, and they can be potentially harmful, at least as they are designed under the climate regime. They can be harmful to biodiversity. And I just mentioned as example, large-scale forest plantations or large-scale hydropower project that maybe not necessarily nature-based solutions, but these are climate solutions that are impacting on biodiversity, which means we're trying to address one problem and we are enhancing another one at the same time. And the challenge here is that under the climate regime, there aren't really biodiversity safeguards. And here, I think the work of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on a global standard for nature-based solution comes in very importantly and very squarely. So Angela, I just wanted to ask you what challenges are there and how can they be addressed so as to implement nature-based solutions in a manner that is both effective but also environmentally sound, ecologically sound, and also I dare say socially sound, and protect the rights and interests of indigenous peoples and local communities.
Exactamente, Cristina, esos temas que tú planteas fueron los que nos llevaron como la Uicn y específicamente la contribución de la Comisión de Gestión de Ecosistemas. Realmente teníamos la misma preocupación porque vemos en el mundo aproximaciones que están mirando solamente el tema de fijación de CO2, que sin duda los ecosistemas cumplen un rol crítico en esto, pero necesitamos ver la problemática de forma integral con todos los temas sociales. Tenemos que garantizar que hay un diálogo adecuado para manejar los trade-offs, o sea, las ventajas, las desventajas de cada acción, porque cualquier intervención tiene trade-offs, sea a nivel ecológico o a nivel social. Entonces, el llamado, y por eso el desarrollo de esta norma, de este estándar que propone la Uicn, es para evitar que se tomen aproximaciones fragmentadas todos estos hechos y para evitar pues que estas externalidades se evidencien y generen conflictos sociales, generen pérdida de biodiversidad. Entonces, en este sentido, el estándar que desarrolla la Iucn, pues busca, está en el centro de toda la definición, la cual difiere de otras aproximaciones, es tener la naturaleza en el centro. Y nosotros pensamos que privilegiar un solo servicio ecosistémico sin tener en cuenta toda esta interacción, pues puede llevarnos a lo que en temas de cambio climático conocemos como mala adaptación. Y esto puede afectar la resiliencia en el largo plazo. Entonces, por esto, pues, el estándar que se presentó el año pasado y el cual está en proceso de aplicación en muchísimos casos, estamos desarrollando mucho más los mecanismos de su implementación. Tiene, por ejemplo, el criterio 2 está absolutamente dirigido a demostrar ganancia neta en biodiversidad. Y no solamente, pues la ganancia neta en biodiversidad la estamos abordando desde el punto de vista de ecosistemas y desde el punto de vista de especies también. El tema ecosistémico a veces empieza, lo hemos visto surgir en las propuestas del próximo marco de la estrategia 2030, pero creemos que requiere ser refortalecido, tiene que ser mucho más claro porque es un nivel diferente de organización. Y todavía estamos acostumbrados a ver la biodiversidad exclusivamente en términos de especies. Entonces, esta ganancia neta hay que evidenciarla. Y de entrada, al tratar de aplicar la norma, pues este tipo de ejemplos muy seguramente no van a calificar para un estándar como el que se propuso, porque en estos casos es evidente que no hay una ganancia neta en biodiversidad. Hemos visto muchos casos donde, por ejemplo, se habla de aforestación, se habla de en las sabanas tropicales como las que tenemos en Colombia, pues se considera a veces que ahí no hay biodiversidad, entonces porque no hay árboles o vegetación arbórea que llame la atención, pero tenemos unos pastizales tropicales riquísimos en biodiversidad que ni siquiera la conocemos, y entonces, y ni siquiera sabemos cuál es su potencial efectivo de secuestro de carbono. Entonces, por eso es necesario que nosotros podamos tener esta visión integral y esto puede ser un efecto negativo de solamente mirar, digamos, el potencial que tienen ciertos ecosistemas en la fijación de carbono, porque podemos llegar a desconocer otros, el rol que cumplen otros ecosistemas, y también pues esto nos puede llevar a distraernos de la urgencia real que es reducir los combustibles fósiles. Eso no nos puede hacer perder la ruta. Entonces a veces pareciera que esto es la solución y contribuye, y en un periodo de tiempo muy claro, porque el costo, la oportunidad efectiva de implementar estas soluciones tiene un tiempo dependiendo de los escenarios de cambio climático a los cuales nos estemos refiriendo. Y obviamente, pues hay otros dos criterios como el 3 y el 4 que hacen mucho énfasis en el rol de las comunidades, en el rol de la gobernanza. Tenemos que garantizar el respeto de todos los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales, y el tema de la gobernanza y sobre todo el manejo de estos trade-offs, que esto tiene que ser un ejercicio colectivo de análisis, no solamente de un grupo de actores involucrados, sino de todos. Pues esto es digamos, un elemento central de negociación y debate, pero pues realmente creemos que este estándar, esta visión holística e integral, sustentada en la base científica del enfoque ecosistémico, se constituye digamos, un aporte fundamental para abordar esta crisis que tenemos de una manera integral y no fragmentada.
Thank you very much, Angela. And with that, we move over to Jane. Jane, you are the global director of the Iucn Biodiversity Conservation Group and the director of the Global Species Program of the Iucn. You also head the delegation of the Iucn to the current negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Jane, Iucn, as the world's oldest nature conservation organization, was instrumental for the preparation and the adoption of the Convention on Biological Diversity itself in 1982. what is the IUCN doing, currently doing, in the efforts to develop the framework further towards the post-2020 global biodiversity framework?
Well, thank you very much, Christina, and greetings to all. Thanks to Antonio for the invite. I'm thrilled to be here. It's amazing to think of that fantastic work by the World Commission on Environmental Law all those years ago, and that it was at the 1984 Madrid General Assembly that discussed the draft articles for inclusion into a new biodiversity convention. And, you know, and the rest they say is history. And it's amazing to think of those beginnings. And if you like, the incredible importance of that convention and everything that's happening right now, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier. So IUCN has stayed engaged with the CBD and indeed the other biodiversity-related conventions and the other 2 Rio conventions all through these years, and is now doing all it can, I hope and think, to support the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Indeed, I think it's true that our colleagues, whether they be in the commissions, the council, the secretariat, all over the regions, and we have 2 commissions represented today, which is wonderful. We have an opinion on every single line of this thing right now. And luckily, I think we're fairly obsessed with all the negotiations. And, you know, I think we need to be because of the importance that all the speakers so far have emphasized, really. The post-2020 framework is central to the new program adopted by IUCN, which was developed over several months involving all the commissions and many other players in IUCN. And we will be rolling out the implementation once that new framework is adopted. More generally, as I said, everybody's engaged. And at the World Conservation Congress, the timing of which, despite all the challenges, I still believe is going to be good, you know, in September, it's in a good position to support the development of the framework and hopefully influence it so that it becomes stronger. There'll be many, many things taking place at that Congress, a post-2020 journey and lots of events, high-level dialogues and all the rest. If there's one overarching point I could make about our view on the framework and, you know, taking on board Tom's points in particular about, you know, what it might be able to do and might not be able to do, we feel it has to galvanize action from all stakeholders at a level commensurate with the challenge. So at a level that will meet those drivers, both direct and indirect, that are facing us now. We need that sense of urgency, if you like. And, you know, spelling out our whole position, we don't have time for, but let me mention, you know, one other thing where perhaps the law could play a part. At the national level, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, the NBSAPs, I think it would be great, and perhaps the law could assist with this, if those held all the biodiversity-related actions that any country needs to do. So not just those from the CBD, but all of those from World Heritage, from Ramsar, from the Convention on Migratory Species, and all the rest. Now, I know that legally this is quite an issue, and actually, Christina, you and I have already had that discussion over the last few weeks, but it would be amazing. And if in addition to that, we can make sure that every country adopts a target which is commensurate with the role it must play in relation to meeting the global intent of that target, which we've been calling in IUCN add-upability, which is a word we invented. You know, if you add up all the pieces of the global targets at the national level, we've got to add up to halt the loss of biodiversity by 2030, halt the net loss of biodiversity by 2030. And we've got to make sure that every country, you know, adopts the right and appropriate targets and then implements them. And that if they don't, we course correct. Perhaps I'll leave it at that at the moment. There's a lot of very strong opinions in IUCN, and I'm just representing a few here.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you for sharing with us. the engagement of IUCN in these global processes. I like your word of adaptability. I hadn't heard it before, so I'll note it. It's very, very interesting. I just want to delve a little bit deeper, if you can talk about it. Are there any particular measures or measures of particular importance or messages that the IUCN brings into the negotiations that are particularly important, both to the IUCN, but hopefully also to many parties and stakeholders, that might help or ensure that the global biodiversity framework, once it is adopted in Kunming, is actually leading to an effective and meaningful outcome?
Well, thank you, Christina. I think one particular technical point I'll just touch on. We are pushing for this framework to make sure it sees through the lens of all three components of biodiversity, so genes, species, and ecosystems. You know, and Elizabeth, I read your I thought it was a great press release you issued today, where you said that restoration could prevent 60% of projected species extinctions. I thought that was a great way of looking at it. And I think lots of the people who work in ecosystem conservation don't necessarily realize how much they're doing for genetic diversity. I think Angela, of course, probably does, but many people don't. They get a bit siloed. And I think we need to make sure we look at all three components of biodiversity, albeit that they sometimes require a different approach in relation to the work that needs to be done. So that was one thing. Angela covered the nature-based solutions standard and the importance of restoration. For sure, that's incredibly important. But let me mention the IUCN Green List of protected and conserved areas, which is a new initiative of IUCN, or relatively new, which is aimed at rewarding good efforts on the ground, if you like, at the protected area level, at the site management level, where it's very empowering because it's sort of bottom up. A site can want to be certified as green listed, and to do that, it has to ensure that it's effectively managed in terms of biodiversity outcomes, and it's equitably governed. And I just want to stress, actually, for David's benefit, this isn't just tokenism. We've built governance fairly and squarely into that standard, which is rigorously applied. And we have all sorts of meetings and committees to make sure that no site gets green listed unless it's well managed and equitably governed. And countries are loving it because it's so positive. It's rewarding something good, albeit, you know, we know that the challenges that are out there are really, really tough. And let me just mention one more thing. And, you know, many people say that species conservation gets maybe too much attention, but I think you all know that Aichi Target 12, which called for the sustained recovery of known threatened species, was, I hate using the F word, but it has failed. It's not done very well, despite some fantastic work. And IUCN's Species Survival Commission in particular, but other commissions are involved too, feels that we need to step up and do more to help governments work for species conservation. So we're doing something quite simple. We're pulling together all of our tools and resources and mapping them to the global biodiversity framework as it stands at the moment, to show how all of those targets could be achieved with the support of species conservation. So it's not just the species related targets, it's all of them. And actually, colleagues in the CBD Secretariat said, Jane, don't just make that about species conservation. You need species conservation for all of the targets. Now, that probably applies to ecosystem conservation as well, but perhaps that's a little bit more obvious. Anyway, so that's what we're doing, and we want to position it as a support and a helpful mechanism to support parties do what they are going to need to do if we're to meet the kind of challenges that Tom laid out so well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And you already played the ball further to David. David, you work on human rights and the environment. You've done fantastic work in your period. I just want to briefly mention, before we focus on your work, the report by your predecessor, Professor John Knox, I'm sorry, from 2017, the special report on human rights and biodiversity. He particularly looked at biodiversity, and where he stated very clearly that the loss of biodiversity undermines the full enjoyment of human rights. David, what are the linkages between biodiversity, degradation, and destruction, and human rights?
Well, thank you, Christina, and thanks for bringing up John's terrific report from several years ago. You know, in your opening comments, you mentioned biodiversity is life. Biodiversity is the book of life. And I thought those are beautiful phrases. And there's such a broad range of human rights that are affected by the loss of biodiversity and the deterioration of ecosystems. The right to life, the right to health, the right to food, to water, to culture, the right to a healthy environment, the right to development, and of course, the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And there are countless examples of this, but let me share a few so that we can take this from the abstract to the concrete. You know, there's concrete scientific evidence that in coastal communities where there are intact mangrove ecosystems, those communities are far less likely to suffer deaths during hurricanes than communities that have lost those mangrove ecosystems. So there's a direct connection between mangroves and the right to life. We know that intact forests absorb water and reduce the severity and the intensity of floods, which claim tens of thousands of human lives around the world every year. We know that healthy ecosystems are a critical, important buffer against disease. So these emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin, which are exemplified by this horrible COVID-19 pandemic we find ourselves in, healthy ecosystems are a critical buffer against those types of diseases. For example, we know that the spread of West Nile virus is blocked by healthy bird biodiversity and is exacerbated in areas where bird biodiversity has declined. When we look at the human right to food as another example, I mean, we know that healthy marine ecosystems are critical for fish, and 1 billion people around the world depend on fish for protein. All of us depend on pollinators for a vast array of crops that require the pollination of birds and bats and bees. And so there are just so many linkages between healthy ecosystems and healthy biodiversity that I also did a report. I mean, my predecessor, John Knox, did a report. I also presented a report last fall to the General Assembly called Human Rights Depend on a Healthy Biosphere. And we have to understand these critical connections, which of course, indigenous people have understood for millennia. And I think it's important to recognize that contribution of indigenous wisdom, but also to recognize it's not just indigenous people who depend on biodiversity. They're more directly connected to it in their traditional lifestyles, but all of us, every single person on this planet depends on healthy biodiversity.
Thank you so much, David. I was just about mentioning your report, but I'm glad you brought it in already, because my follow-up question to you was, you highlighted the, oh, sorry, you switched around on my screen. You highlighted the let's say the factual connection between biodiversity decline and human rights impacts. Where does the law come in? How can the law help to address this detrimental connection?
Yeah, so there's a number of really critical points here. And some of my colleagues, including Elizabeth, have talked about the importance of the environmental rule of law. You know, almost every country has laws on the books that are not being implemented and enforced because of weaknesses in institutions, because of government corruption, because of inadequate resources. So, you know, a really key issue is tackling the rule of law. We also need stronger environmental laws, but I think that we really need to be quite realistic, and we need to look at what has happened since 1992 and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Targets were set. There were targets set in 2000. None of those targets were met by 2010. New targets, the Aichi targets, were set. None of the Aichi targets fully met by 2020. There's a problem that we have to acknowledge, that what we're doing isn't working. And I'm deeply concerned that if we just set a bunch of new targets for 2030, the same kind of structural problems will inhibit the achievement of those targets. And so this is where I come at things from a human rights perspective, because human rights, there are mechanisms both nationally and internationally that, through human rights mechanisms, that ensure accountability. And that in my mind, is the missing link of international environmental law, which you know probably better than anybody, Christina, that there are just a lack of enforcement mechanisms under the Convention on Biodiversity, under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, under the Paris Agreement. And what we're seeing in the last 2 or 3 years is the use of human rights in the climate context to provide that missing link, to provide accountability in some really exciting developments that continue to happen almost on a monthly basis in the field of climate litigation, where those commitments under international environmental law are being made real by international human rights law.
Thank you very much, David. And I wouldn't even say it's a monthly basis. It feels like a daily basis that we get a new judgment in the climate field. And it's a very interesting observation. And I wonder if we see this wave in climate litigation, primarily brought by young people, by children, by young adults that are worried about their own future and how their own adulthood will look like if they grow up into a world that is impacted by climate change. We haven't yet seen the same kind of strategic litigation based on biodiversity, or maybe we have and I missed it. But do you think we see, based on the science and maybe even the political focus around the global biodiversity framework, we see perhaps similar mobilization of young people behind a policy that protects biodiversity? Like, is it maybe Thursdays for nature and Fridays for climate? And maybe even taking governments that do not act in accordance with what needs to be done to court? Is it the next big wave?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Christina, and one which I'm really interested in. There has been, over the course of the past decade, more than 1,000 different climate lawsuits have been brought against governments and businesses around the world. But of that 1,000+ cases, there's about 70 or so that have been based on human rights. And those are the cases that we're seeing have the most direct and dramatic impact. The famous Urgenda case from the Netherlands, the recent decision of the German Constitutional Court in the Neubauer case, the decision in the Netherlands again in the Royal Dutch Shell case just a few weeks ago, the Sharma case in Australia, another of those cases brought by young people, as you've mentioned. There's one case globally that I think indicates a shift towards the biodiversity-based litigation. And I think, there's lots of, let me be clear, first of all, there has been a ton of litigation around biodiversity over the past 40 years. You can go back to cases brought in the United States under the Endangered Species Act, in Canada under the Species at Risk Act, in Europe under the nature directives. But the case I want to really highlight for people was a case brought by 25 children and youth in Colombia, which Angela will of course be familiar with, where they filed a lawsuit against the government of Colombia, arguing that deforestation in the Amazon, in the Colombian portion of the Amazon, violated their constitutional right to a healthy environment. And the Supreme Court of Colombia said, you young people are absolutely right. Your constitutional right to a healthy environment is violated by deforestation. And of course, as we all know, deforestation is a significant contributor both to climate change and to the loss of biodiversity. So I'm currently just embarked on a research project with my colleague Cesar Rodriguez Garavito from New York University. We are looking around the world at the state of biodiversity litigation with a particular focus on rights-based biodiversity litigation, because I think we will see a surge in that in the years ahead.
And Cesar is, of course, the right person to work with, because he was representing the claimants in that particular case in Colombia. And it's also interesting because the Supreme Court of Colombia not only based its judgment on the human rights of the young litigants, but also found that the Amazon, the Colombian Amazon had a right in itself, was a holder of a right which is complementary to the human rights of the young claimants. How do you see at these different rights-based approaches? Do they support each other? Do they stand in each other's way? Is that something that we see more of in the years to come? What do you think?
Yeah, I actually think that the human right to a healthy environment and this kind of newer concept of the rights of nature herself are quite complementary. And I say that because, the human right to a healthy environment, as it has been interpreted by legislatures and courts over the past 40 years, includes 6 key substantive components: clean air, clean water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a stable climate, non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play, and critically for our discussion today, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. So we have seen, for example, cases around the world where endangered species have been protected by individuals bringing forth cases based on their individual human right to a healthy environment. So healthy ecosystems and biodiversity are a critical part of that human right, which makes absolute sense because humans are not, as we have for so long erroneously thought, we are not separate from or superior to nature. As Thomas mentioned, we share DNA, the basic building block of life, with every other form of life on the planet. And I think that as we see these more progressive interpretations of the right to a healthy environment, as you suggested in Colombia, also coming from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, also from courts in Mexico, this is really a powerful force, and I think quite a promising one in terms of addressing the global biodiversity crisis.
Thank you. And there's increasing recognition both in national constitutions by more than, what is it now, 150 plus states, but also hopefully soon on the international level of a human right to clean and healthy environment. And you're one of the strongest promoters of such recognition for the reasons that you just gave to us. Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for both your comments today, but also for spearheading that absolutely important initiative. Now, I'm keeping half an eye on the time here. We are sort of in the third part of our discussion today. And I would like to point to you some of the questions that we've received from the audience. But because it's been such a rich discussion, I just wanted to give brief the opportunity to each one of you, if you wanted to reflect on something that the other panelists have said. Is there something that you'd like to comment on or reflect on? I just wanted to give you the chance because we had these 5 talks, one after the other, but I just wanted to make it a bit more interactive. Jane, please. Yes.
Yeah, I just very briefly, I really feel for Elizabeth right now because what's happening is hard. And it's hard because the stakes have gone up. And we all hear this criticism that another bunch of targets might not be met either. But what I keep saying to people internally is, the world is waking up, and it might not quite wake up in time enough, for when that framework gets adopted. But I think in the next 5 years, it will continue to wake up. And that, therefore, those words that are set down in that framework become incredibly important. So although, the process, I'm sure, can drive all of us nuts, sorry to be direct, Elizabeth, and I bet your staff are really tired, and I think the way you're all hanging in there is amazing. Those words become something absolutely extraordinary, whatever the frustrations of the process. And then, after we've got it, then you clever lawyers should come in and make something of this, go for it. I'll just leave it at that. But I just, I get a little bit worried when we sort of, we mustn't diss this process too much just because it's hard and difficult and frustrating. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I saw David raised his hand. I just want to give Elizabeth the floor first because Jane addressed her directly, and then I come back to you, David. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Delighted, Jen, that you feel it for me. Indeed, the process going on is not easy. And especially learning from the past clearly shows how not easy it is. But yes, but the world is, we are learning. And COVID-19 has taught us, literally reminding us that our actions cannot continue we cannot continue with the activities the way we were doing yesterday. Either, as I think David mentioned, we should be ready for even more serious pandemics than the COVID if we are not changing our relationship with nature. When it comes to the law, the lawyers, environmental law, I think that's where there's even more challenge. because really, I think the law now also needs to change with the movement. David is indicating the right to virtually everything. How are all these rights protected by the law? We know the plight of indigenous peoples and local communities. Don't we know their rights? Don't we know that when decisions affecting them are taken, they need to be part of that decision-making process? They need to be supported to be able to participate. Principle 10 of Rio Declaration. Much as Principle 10 of Rio Declaration is almost over 30 years old, but we are still arguing about it today. We are still arguing. So the issue of awareness raising, is it capacity building, training, with all the changes coming and the trend of the changes going on, those will need to continue. Why did we have to wait until the children, the youth now have literally made this movement, either walk in the streets or go to court to get action being done? Weren't we seeing? Were we waiting our children to give us the message? So a lot still needs to be done. And I think we need ourselves this switch of our own minds and thinking before really tangible changes can be seen on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you for reminding us of the burden we are putting on those that are young today and grow up into a very uncertain future. And I think their awareness is rising, and I think that is important, but it should not alleviate us from our responsibility, not at all. David.
Thank you, Christina. I do want to just clarify that I think having ambitious, bold targets in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is fundamentally important. But I think it's also critical that we recognize that, as I mentioned, we have to take a rights-based approach to all aspects of conservation. We have seen countless examples through the recent decades, and not just historical examples, but ongoing examples of where the rights of indigenous people and local communities are being violated by exclusionary conservation practices. And so that's why I believe in the actual framework itself, we have to have a real focus on human rights and calling for the inclusion of a rights-based approach to all aspects of conservation. And that is not solely for indigenous peoples and local communities, because as I will reiterate, all of us depend on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. So having the right to a healthy environment embedded in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is critical. And then we can call upon states to recognize that at the national level and implement that at the national level. And it empowers everybody to protect that right which they have and which is critical to their well-being. And we know from the climate experience, people will take that right and they will use it to hold governments accountable. And the targets which were set under the Kyoto Protocol and the targets set by individual states through their nationally determined contributions, many states have not kept those commitments, but now courts are holding them to those commitments. So in Germany, in the Netherlands, courts are saying, because of their human rights obligations and responsibilities, both governments and businesses must take action to meet those targets. They must take action. And so that is really, to my mind, a critical shift in accountability that gives me great optimism as we move forward over the next decade, that we will see greater progress towards achieving these targets that are so critical that we are setting today. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Antonio, please.
Well, Christina, I was trying as much as I could to resist the temptation of jumping into this debate, but it's impossible.
It didn't work.
It didn't work. I apologize for that. I'm so embarrassed. Let me just touch on two points that have been part of this discussion in in the last few minutes, the one on targets and the one on the rights approach. Targets in law are very useful, but for the not so much as a cause for celebration. In other words, that we meet targets, but for embarrassment. So it is important, first of all, for that. It plays in the legal and especially in the judicial discourse a very important role. We are too far from reaching our goals. And this gives especially judges a sense of urgency, but at the same time, a clear sense that whomever had the duty to reach those targets should be dealt in the proper manner, considered responsible for that. So that's the first point I wanted to make. So it's a completely different role that a target plays in law. And this applies to the environmental law, but also to other areas like poverty, famine, illiteracy, and so on. They are put there as a guide, more concrete to the future, and they are still very useful even when they are not achieved, and we know that they are not going to be entirely achieved. The second point that I'd like to make is on the rights approach. I think it's very important that we move our vocabulary from the rights approach to a more comprehensive one that includes the duty approach. It's the rights and duty approach. We judges have huge difficulties with the implementation of rights. We still have difficulties with implementation of duties, and especially clear duties, but they are, I don't know why, we can explore this, perhaps another webinar, a book, but invite the psychologists as well. But we judges feel more comfortable in implementing and deciding about clear duties that are expressed in the legal system. So talking about just rights is fantastic. It brings us all the way to the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution, to the modern constitutions and so on. But the very modern constitutions emphasize, in parallel to rights, duties, and duties that are individual, are collective, are private, are state, are towards other individuals, groups, and future generations, and nature in general. So those are the two comments that I want to make. I couldn't resist. Fantastic debate.
And I'm glad you didn't resist, Antonio. These were extremely important points that you raised. So thank you for not resisting. Let me please turn to the questions that we received from the audience. Marina Venancio in the background, she was so kind to collecting them, and I'll just post them to the respective panelists as they were put in the chat, in the Q&A. Elizabeth, there's a question to you on the interconnection between the biodiversity and the climate crises. You mentioned that there is a need to adopt an integrated approach. We talked about addressing fragmentation, a holistic approach in several of the interventions, but you mentioned an integrated approach concerning biodiversity and climate issues. So in light of that, what would be the next steps in guaranteeing this integration? In other words, how can this be achieved in practice?
Thank you. I can direct the participants straight to our latest global biodiversity outlook, the 5th one, which was launched last year. And in that one, it proposes about 8 transitions, really, if we are to see tangible changes. And all of them have a direct connection with both biodiversity loss, climate change, land degradation, pollution, and the like. Sustainable agriculture, sustainable fisheries, sustainable, which then concludes with the last transition is One Health approach. Because when you talk of health, is it our choice of our diets, are they sustainable? The food chain from the farm to the kitchen, how sustainable is that? And how also when we talk of that agricultural production, then our consumption, I mean, all that. So really, for any solution on these matters, that integrated approach comes in. And when we look at health, and particularly the pandemic has taught us, is that for a good health of human well-being, it means that food from the soil need to have been good, not full of pesticides or chemicals from the soil. The food chain system to where the food is bought at the supermarket is equally sustainable, to be able to reduce the cost of dealing with health by the country. Is it the health, I mean, the hospital bill, the equipment at the hospital, because the population will be more healthier, but it can be healthier if what we are eating is not healthy. It cannot be healthier if what we are choosing to eat is not healthy. So these solutions, which are by themselves showing that integration, need to be borne in mind. Climate change now are looking at nature-based solutions and nature. So clearly, the climate change community has seen, even for climate change, still nature provides that solution. And we know 30% of greenhouse emission actually comes from biodiversity for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And 30% is not a small number. And that again shows the integration, interconnected nature of climate change and biodiversity loss. And that the solutions, as climate change tells us, are in nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And this links over to another question, very short question, but posing, probably prompting a difficult answer. And I put it to Jane. The IPBES report does mention transformative change. It's a new concept, maybe it's something that the report pointed out. The IPCC had a similar concept talking about transition that are necessary. And the question is simple, it's like, how to promote transformative change? What are main enabling elements for transformative change?
Well, that's quite a tough one. The CBD held a series of very interesting seminars on what is transformative change and the kind of triggers that bring it about. And people talk about movements as if they can sort of invent them, and I don't think they can, but they can be triggered. And I hear that the word transformative, and I see that the word transformative is getting into some trouble in the negotiations. Let me say, though, that, if all the Aichi targets had been implemented, or even just Aichi Target 3 on reforming perverse subsidies, $360 billion a year spent on destroying nature rather than looking after nature, to put it simply, that would have been transformative. So, I think it's a mixture of how the world is feeling, and people have mentioned youth, and how the triggers and the pressures for change are coming not from the normal suspects, the usual suspects, like the likes of us here, if you like, but elsewhere. So in the end, we've got to keep going, I think, the way we go, which is sometimes painful, as we've agreed, hoping that the youth will carry on putting pressure on us, and that somehow these triggers, trigger us into moving into something transformational. I think the IPBES report had it really well. I think they really described and articulated what that looked like extremely well. Maybe I'll leave it at that. It's an interesting question. Thanks.
That might actually be a question for another webinar, because transformative change is such an all-compassing concept and it reaches into everything. Angela, you mentioned several measures that you researched on and you advocate and you work on. There is a question in the chat on how to ensure implementation of these measures. What enabling conditions would you foresee that ensure that these measures are not just designed and known, but are actually being implemented and maybe eventually enforced? But that's more of a legal issue. But enabling environments, is that something you've worked on, and can you share some views?
Bueno, de los temas que yo mencioné, pues sin duda yo veo que muchos de ellos están involucrados en la práctica de la gestión ambiental, por lo menos, por ejemplo, en Colombia, donde claramente existen acciones y digamos, marcos legales para la conservación de áreas protegidas, para la restauración, para todos estos temas de uso sostenible. Mi tema y mi preocupación es que están desconectados. Entonces, lo que yo mencioné en la presentación, muchas de estas aproximaciones son fragmentadas y no miran el resto. Entonces, en el largo plazo, estas contradicciones están generando problemas sociales, problemas ambientales. Entonces, es un llamado a la búsqueda de esa articulación, que en aras de implementar una norma no se esté afectando otro elemento que puede generar un incentivo perverso. Entonces, yo creo que es un llamado a esto, y también quería comentar muy rápido respecto al tema anterior, que también me parece interesante e importante que la métrica o que la información que se dé muestre datos que vayan articulados y vinculados. Por ejemplo, nosotros en nuestros territorios damos cifras de deforestación todos los años, pero nunca una de estas cifras nos dice cuánta población de comunidades indígenas ha sido desplazada o cuántas comunidades locales han sido afectadas. Entonces, cuando nosotros empezamos a tener datos articulados y le metemos temas de cambio climático a esto, vamos a tener una mejor lectura y una mejor aproximación al problema. Pero esta fragmentación también de cifras, de información, nos permite ver la complejidad de lo que está pasando y despersonalizarla. Entonces, sí, tumbaron 100.000 hectáreas, qué lástima, ¿no? Pero es que lo que hay detrás de eso es muy doloroso, y no es solamente la deforestación únicamente, sino todo lo que va detrás de eso. Entonces yo creo que tenemos que, aprovechando este marco de discusión, es importante también que la información que se esté suministrando y que apoye estos procesos supla este vacío de fragmentación que creo que es el principal problema en la forma de la gestión ambiental que tenemos. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Angela. And it's interesting because it links back to a topic we started out from when we talked about cross-sectoral integrated approaches that address that fragmentation that we're seeing, which is one of the main problems for an effective approach and implementation of those measures and laws that you highlighted earlier. We have time for one last question, and that's to you, David. David, we already talked about rights of nature. There's a question saying, well, human rights and rights of nature are indeed complementary, as you pointed out. But do you think the trend of rights of nature will help making biodiversity law more effective in the midterm?
Yeah, I do think that the rights of nature is a powerful concept legally where it is recognized. And that is the challenge, that in comparison to the right to a healthy environment, which is recognized by over 150 countries around the world, there's only approximately 10 countries where the rights of nature have legal recognition. So, in the Constitution of Ecuador, in the legislation of Bolivia, in court decisions from Mexico, Colombia, in legislation in Uganda, and then at the subnational level in a number of countries. But it doesn't have that same global recognition yet that we're working towards in terms of the right to a healthy environment. So in terms of the short term, I think, yes, in those places where the rights of nature have legal recognition, it's a powerful tool. But I think that, you know, the right to a healthy environment has a longer track record, broader recognition, and therefore is more important in the short term in terms of getting it to complete recognition so that the UN finally recognizes it, and then working hard to implement it everywhere in the world.
Thank you very much, David. I guess we basically need all the tools in the toolbox, whatever rights and duties and policies and measures we can get, because it is something that defines our future, and we need an effective response to it that changes values and behaviors, and that rather quickly, as Thomas pointed out. I think we lost Thomas here, so otherwise I would have posed a question to him as well. This is the end of our webinar. We've already gone a little bit over, but I thought it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, Jane and Angela and Elizabeth and David and Thomas as well, and Antonio, to whom I just give the floor back in a second. Thank you so much for taking your time, dedicating your time at the end of a long day, a long week. It's very, very much appreciated. Many thanks from the World Commission on Environmental Law. But I would also like to thank very much the Executive Officer of the WCL, Emily Gaskin, who has been tireless in preparing and looking that we get this done without any technical glitches. Thank you so much, Emily, for being there for us. Many thanks to the interpreters. That is absolutely fantastic that we can reach out to a truly global audience by making it accessible, not only in English, but also in French and in Spanish simultaneously. And thank you very much, Marina. You were just in for preparing the questions for today. That was very, very helpful. And thank you to the audience. We had about 100 plus participants all the time. Thank you for your time as well, and for your questions. It's very, very much appreciated that you gave us your attention on this Friday evening. And with that, I turn back to Antonio.
Well, thank you, Christina, so much. This was indeed a fantastic webinar. We are very tired of webinars. We cannot even hear the name anymore, but there are webinars and webinars, and I believe this one was enlightening. It was rich information. Everyone knew what she or he was talking about with deep knowledge, experience. But my strongest word of gratitude is to our moderator, because she brings knowledge, entertainment. She makes law look and feel as if it were easy. We feel empowered. We can do it. It's possible. And in environmental law, this optimism is absolutely central. Without optimism in environmental law, we would go nowhere. So, Christina, many thanks for making this, with this fantastic team, a fantastic webinar. And I echo you in thanking Emily Gaskin, who works tirelessly to make it possible. Emily is a lawyer, an environmental law graduate from the University of Hawaii, former student of Professor Denise Antolini, another a star in our environmental law family, and we are very grateful to you. And as well, I repeat, Christina, but it's never enough to thank the interpreters. They are the ones that make us speak the same language without speaking the same language and understanding each other. So with that, on this note, I mean, of a bit of sadness, 5 days, but there is much more to come in this global conversation, permanent conversation on environmental law. Thank you very much.